The Greek word kenos means to empty, and in Christian theology, kenosis refers to the self-emptying of Jesus, as explained by St. Paul in the New Testament. Sunyata, in Buddhism, also means emptiness. I came across this parallel while putting together a recent video on a non-dualistic interpretation of God. When I searched for whether there was any literature exploring the parallel, I came across a very interesting essay by the Japanese philosopher Maseo Abe, written in 1984, but which is perhaps even more relevant today than it was then, or at least more pressing. Abe was one of the later thinkers of the Kyoto school, which we explored in the previous video, and which I would suggest watching after this video if you haven't already. Abe took the hybrid Zen and continental philosophy of the Kyoto school and brought it into dialogue with Christianity in an effort to provide an answer to the modern problem of nihilism versus spiritual awareness generally. This video is largely based on Abe's essay, and I think you'll find it particularly interesting and relevant to many of the themes we've been discussing recently on this channel. I hope you enjoy listening, and thank you as always for lending me your attention for this short time. Over the past few decades, Buddhist-Christian dialogue has moved beyond simply promoting mutual understanding and is now increasingly concerned with the possibility of mutual transformation. This dialogue should not be treated as a narrow interfaith exchange alone, but as part of a wider historical and cultural crisis in which religion itself is being questioned by secular ideologies such as scientism, Marxism, Freudianism, and nihilism. Abe argues that the real task of religion today is to respond to these anti-religious forces by clarifying the authentic meaning of faith. In that sense, Buddhist-Christian dialogue becomes meaningful only if it addresses the deeper issue of religion versus irreligion and helps to answer the modern problem of human self-estrangement. Both Buddhism and Christianity are, he suggests, in a transitional crisis that requires more than gradual development. It calls for a fundamental transformation of their basic assumptions, possibly through a new understanding of God in Christianity and emptiness in Buddhism. Abe's concern is primarily directed at science and nihilism. He first distinguishes science from scientism. Science and religion are not necessarily opposed and may even be compatible, but scientism wrongly absolutizes the scientific method and treats anything non-scientific, including religion, as false. In this view, religion is dismissed in principle as something that will eventually disappear once science has fully prevailed. Modern physics has already weakened the older mechanistic worldview associated with classical science. This makes science less inherently hostile to religion than it once seemed. Still, if scientific thinking is dogmatized, it becomes scientism again, and religion remains under challenge. For Christianity, the key problem is how critical rationality can coexist positively with the biblical God, understood not as an object of possession, but as a personal thou. Buddhism faces a somewhat different challenge, since its basis is awakening to Dharma, or suchness, emptiness, rather than faith in a personal God. Even so, Buddhism too must show how emptiness can embrace the autonomy of reason while also preserving its freedom. Both traditions must clarify the religious meaning of their truths in relation to scientific truth. Nihilism, especially in Nietzsche's sense, is not just a vague feeling of meaninglessness, but a historical awakened crisis that forces modern people to rethink the basis of culture and religion. In Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, nihilism is rooted in Western history. God is dead means that the super-sensible world no longer has force, and the highest values have lost their meaning. There are two forms of nihilism. Nihilism before religion, which refers to the ordinary experience of emptiness before a genuine religious awakening, and which may still be overcome by faith, and nihilism beyond religion, which arises after religion itself has been deeply experienced and then judged as empty. Nietzsche's God is dead belongs to the second kind, which is more radical because it attacks religion from within rather than from outside. This makes Nietzsche a serious challenge, not only to Christianity, but to all religions, including Buddhism. Traditional religion can no longer be treated as self-evident. Instead, each faith must show its own raison d'etre in the face of nihilism. That is why Buddhist-Christian dialogue must be placed against the backdrop of both scientism and nihilism. Only then can the two traditions seriously explore how each might overcome these crises and open toward a deeper, shared religious dimension. Abe's discussion on the kenosis, or self-emptying of Christ, begins with Paul's hymn in the Philippians. Christ, though in the form of God, emptied himself and became obedient unto death, yea, the death of the cross. This is the key Christian image of kenosis. Christ's self-emptying is a complete self-abnegation, revealing God as unconditional love. This should not be understood as merely a historical sequence in which the Son of God first existed and then later emptied himself. Rather, self-emptying is Christ's very nature. The Son of God is essentially the one who gives himself away. On this reading, incarnation is not an object to be analysed from outside, but a living present reality in which divine self-emptying is revealed. Consubstantiality should not be taken simply as the union of two substances, divine and human, but as one non-dual function of self-emptying. What matters is not static identity, but the living movement by which Christ is fully God and fully human in the act of self-giving. This also has direct significance for the human self. Christ's kenosis only becomes religiously meaningful when it is connected to our own ego's death and renewal. The old self must die with Christ, so that the new self may live in Christ. In this sense, salvation is not continuity of the old ego, but its radical negation and transformation into a new life. We can therefore say that the Son of God is not the Son of God, for he is essentially and fundamentally self-emptying. Precisely because he is not the Son of God, he is truly the Son of God, for he originally and always works as Christ, the Messiah, in his salvational function of self-emptying. Or, in relation to the human self, self is not self, for the old self must be crucified. Precisely because it is not self, it is truly self, for the new self is resurrected. And Christ's kenosis cannot be separated from his exaltation. In the Philippians, Christ is first humbled into self-emptying and then highly exalted by God. These two states must be held together. The theology of the cross is incomplete without the theology of glory. Christ's humiliation leads to his sovereignty, so kenosis should not be read as humiliation alone. But the self-emptying aspect is important for us to acknowledge, because the traditional idea of the Son's pre-existence needs to be rethought in light of modern critiques of religion, including critical rationality, existential atheism, and nihilism. Furthermore, if the Son of God truly empties himself, then this self-emptying must already belong to God's own nature as love. And God's self-emptying should not be understood as partial or limited, with God still remaining detached above the world. Rather, God's kenosis must be total, so that God gives God's self wholly to the world and to sinful humanity. There is no dualism between God's infinite fullness and God's self-giving. Such a split weakens the radical meaning of divine love. If God is truly kenotic, then self-emptying is not just one attribute of God, but God's fundamental reality. Only a fully self-emptying, suffering, and self-sacrificial God can save everything and fully reveal divine love. This radical, kenotic understanding of God is important for Buddhist-Christian dialogue. It challenges Nietzsche's nihilism by showing that God's self-giving is not meaningless sacrifice, but the ground of redemption. At the same time, It opens a common space with Buddhism, since it resonates with the idea that ultimate reality is not found in self-assertion, but in emptiness and self-negation. In parallel, human beings also realize their true self only when the ego is completely negated. Self is not self. Precisely because it is not, self is truly self. Through total kenosis, God is not merely something else, but is identical with all things. This is not pantheism in the Spinozan sense. Unlike a view that simply identifies God with the world, the point is that God is all things only through total self-emptying. The kenotic God is therefore both fully immanent and fully transcendent, and remains deeply personal because divine love embraces everything, including the sinful and unjust. And also, this does not erase the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. Christ remains unique not because the Son of God retained divinity while becoming human, but because Christ reveals the total self-negation of God in history. If the cross manifests God's complete self-emptying in Jesus, then that same kenotic reality can also be understood as reaching beyond Christ to all things in the universe. Christ uniquely reveals the universal kenotic nature of God. Abe also thinks that the paradox of how Christ can be dead on the cross and yet is not dead can be resolved only if we go beyond the ordinary distinction between the one God and the three persons. For Abe, the one God of the Trinity must be understood as the infinite potentiality or no-thingness that exists before God's self-revelation, nichts or Urgrund. Only then can the oneness of God be preserved without becoming a hidden fourth being, and only then can the Trinity be truly dynamic. This is also God as self-emptying love, rather than a merely self-affirming subject. God is most profoundly encountered from within the divine ground, where God is neither simply subject nor predicate, but nichts, the non-dual reality in which God is love because God is nichts, nichts is God because nichts is love. Here, Abe believes, Christian faith, human salvation, and the critique of modern atheism and nihilism can all be brought together. This move also brings Christianity closer to Buddhism, since nichts, or the ultimate ground, resonates with the Buddhist emphasis on emptiness and non-duality. Turning now to Buddhism, where the ultimate reality is not being or God, but sunyata, emptiness or voidness. Sunyata cannot be treated as a thing outside the self, or as an object of thought or attachment. If emptiness is grasped as something representable, it ceases to be true emptiness. Mahayana Buddhism therefore insists that sunyata must also be emptied of any fixed notion of emptiness itself. Sunyata is completely self-negating. It empties everything, including itself. The Heart Sutra expresses this dynamic non-duality when it says, form is emptiness, and that very emptiness is form. This does not mean a static identity, but a continual process in which form is emptied and emptiness is emptied into form. Mountains are truly mountains only when they are not attached to as mountains. In the same way, emptiness is real only when it is not clung to as emptiness. True sunyata is therefore not a distant metaphysical state, but a living reality realized in the absolute present. A positive meaning of sunyata can be summarized in 5 points. First, sunyata is the place where everything is revealed in its suchness, tathata. Each thing is fully itself, yet all things are equally affirmed without being reduced to one monistic principle. This is why Buddhism can value both distinctiveness and equality. Unlike Christianity, it does not begin from an I-thou relation to a personal God, but from a universal, transpersonal field in which humans, nature, and even the divine are all equally seen as they are. Buddha is not a supernatural ruler, but the awakened one who realizes this truth. Second, sunyata is boundless openness without any fixed center. It is free from egocentrism, anthropocentrism, cosmocentrism, and theocentrism. In this openness, all things become mutually dominant and mutually subordinate. Third, sunyata is ji-nen, or swa-yombo, self-so, naturalness, spontaneity. It is not a static condition, but the deepest natural activity from which things arise and to which they return. This spontaneity lies beyond all will, including human will and divine will. Fourth, sunyata reveals the mutual reversibility of things. Space, time, and value are all interpenetrating and reciprocal. History is therefore not simply linear, and even the contrast between good and evil is transformed at the ultimate level. Fifth, and most importantly, sunyata is wisdom, prajna, and compassion, karuna. Wisdom affirms all things in their suchness. Compassion overturns ordinary moral order and makes universal salvation possible. At the same time, if sunyata transcends ordinary rational distinctions, what becomes of science and reason? If good and evil are reversible, what becomes of ethics? If past and future interpenetrate, what becomes of history and novelty? The answer is that sunyata is not simply a goal to be attained, but the ground from which Buddhist life begins. It is also fundamentally non-sunyata, emptiness that empties even itself. In that sense, sunyata re-establishes distinctions without absolutizing them. This allows Buddhism to respond to modernity while remaining open to Christian dialogue, especially around themes like self-emptying, universal salvation, and the transformation of selfhood. Buddhist tradition has often distrusted human reason, treating conceptual, discriminating thought as something to be overcome in awakening. This differs sharply from the Western tradition, where thinkers like Kant and Hegel saw reason as central to knowledge, ethics, and philosophy. In Buddhism, the goal is not speculative knowledge, but liberation from ignorance through direct awakening to suchness. This awakening is called non-discriminating wisdom, nirvikalpanyana, or hishiryo, non-thinking thinking. This is not mere absence of thought, but a deeper mode of thinking beyond the opposition between thinking and not thinking, subject and object. In this state, thinking, being, and true self are one. At the same time, Buddhism has historically failed to recognize the creative possibilities of reason as developed in modern Western thought. Sunyata is dynamic enough to embrace not only ordinary thinking, but also the transcendental reason of Kant and the dialectical reason of Hegel. If Buddhism realized this potential more fully, it could engage science and rationality more constructively without losing its spiritual depth. Buddhism has also traditionally not treated will positively, unlike much of Western philosophy, Christianity, and even Nietzsche. In the West, free will has often been seen as essential to personhood and morality. Christianity, however, also views human will ambivalently. Human will is linked to sin, while God's will is affirmed as the source of creation, redemption, and judgment. Buddhism, by contrast, sees will as something to be transcended through awakening to sunyata and ji-nen, the primordial spontaneity beyond will. This has clear positive effects. It helps overcome anthropocentrism, the conflict between flesh and reason, and the problem of original sin as rebellion against God's will. But there are also unresolved difficulties. If sunyata is beyond all will, how can human freedom be grounded? How can evil be explained? And how can a personal deity serve as a moral criterion? Buddhism must address these issues if it is to offer a full basis for ethics and modern rationality, and Christianity may help supply some of the needed resources. In Buddhism, karma is volitional action. It is intentional deed rooted in consciousness and free will. Unlike the Hindu view, Buddhist karma is not mechanically deterministic, it is conditional, organic, and generative. It shapes both present life and future possibilities. Karma is morally significant because conscious motive matters most. Actions driven by greed, hatred, and delusion carry responsibility. Karma is also not purely individualistic. Because all beings are interrelated, one person's actions affect others and reverberate through the whole universe and human history. The individual and collective dimensions of karma are united at the deepest level in avidya, fundamental ignorance, or the blind will to live, which underlies self-centeredness and karmic bondage. This means human freedom in Buddhism must be understood through the overcoming of ignorance and ego-centered will. Only when this self-centered karmic structure is broken can one awaken to emptiness and suchness. This also gives Buddhism a way to engage Christian concerns about responsibility, evil, and salvation. Evil in Buddhism arises when one becomes attached to sunyata instead of living its dynamic emptying. In Mahayana, even religious striving can become karmic if it is driven by volition and attachment. True liberation comes only when seeking ceases and one lives in spontaneous, non-attached openness. Evil, then, is rooted in avidya. This ignorance appears suddenly, without a rational cause, much like the sudden temptation in the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. The serpent is only an occasion. The real cause lies in the human free will that accepts temptation. Both Christianity and Buddhism thus locate the source of evil in a deeper inward condition, not merely in external circumstances. When consciousness clings to self and objects, sunyata becomes reified and turns into karmic bondage. But when attachment is fully emptied, karma ceases and avidya turns into vidya, ignorance into awakening. Enlightenment and ignorance, samsara and nirvana, are dynamically convertible in the absolute present. In this sense, evil is overcome not by suppressing life, but by realizing sunyata in its living, self-emptying movement.